It began with a phone call that looked legitimate, then turned into a scam that convinced people their bank accounts were under immediate threat. The caller claimed to be from a bank or even law enforcement, using real names, badge numbers, and urgent language to create fear. Victims were told their money was at risk and needed to be moved quickly to secure accounts for protection. The instructions sounded official, sometimes backed by follow-up calls from someone posing as police or fraud investigators. Within hours, people transferred thousands and, in many cases, entire savings, believing they were preventing a crime. Globally, impersonation scams like this have caused losses in the billions, with thousands of cases reported each year. By the time victims contacted their real bank or authorities, the money had already been moved through multiple channels. What felt like protection was actually a coordinated system designed to exploit urgency and authority. By the late 2010s and early 2020s, impersonation scams had become one of the fastest-growing fraud categories across countries like Australia, the UK, and the United States. These scams were typically run by organized groups using call centers equipped with scripts, caller ID spoofing tools, and databases of personal information. Victims often received calls that appeared to come from their actual bank, with the correct name displayed on their phone screen. In other cases, the caller introduced themselves as officers from agencies like the OAIC or similar authorities to reinforce credibility. The target group was broad, including everyday account holders, retirees, and even people familiar with online banking systems. Many of these scams involved convincing victims that fraudulent activity had already been detected on their accounts. In Australia alone, reports to ScamWatch showed losses in the tens of millions annually from impersonation-based scams. What made these operations effective was the combination of real data, technical tools, and highly structured communication. By the time the conversation ended, victims believed they had just interacted with a legitimate institution responding to a real threat. The call usually began with a calm but urgent tone, informing the victim that suspicious transactions had been detected on their account. Details like recent purchases, partial card numbers, or addresses were sometimes mentioned, making the situation feel real and immediate. The caller would then shift into a controlled explanation, stating that the account had been compromised and required immediate action to prevent further loss. Victims were often told not to contact anyone else during the process under the pretext of an ongoing investigation. In some cases, a second caller would join or follow up, claiming to be from law enforcement, reinforcing the urgency and authority. They were instructed to verify identity details, which were later used to strengthen control over the situation. Gradually, the solution was introduced, moving funds to a safe account or providing secure access to prevent further fraud. The process felt procedural, almost identical to how real institutions handle security incidents. By the time instructions were clearly given, victims believed they were actively protecting their money, not losing it. Once control was established, the scam moved into execution, where victims were guided step by step through what appeared to be legitimate security procedures. They were asked to log into their banking apps, sometimes even while staying on the call, to create a sense of transparency and trust. In many cases, scammers directed victims to transfer funds to accounts described as secure holding accounts or government-protected wallets. Some were instructed to convert their money into cryptocurrency through real exchanges, then send it to addresses provided by the caller. Others were told to install remote access software, allowing scammers to control their devices and initiate transactions directly. The language remained consistent with official procedures, using terms like verification, authorization, and fraud containment. Because the process involved real systems like banking apps and exchanges, it reinforced the illusion that everything was legitimate. Behind the scenes, these accounts and wallets were controlled by the scam networks, with funds quickly dispersed after transfer. By the end of this stage, significant amounts of money had already been moved, often without the victim realizing the irreversible nature of the transaction. As the process continued, victims were often kept on the phone for extended periods, sometimes hours, to maintain control and prevent outside interference. They were reassured repeatedly that they were doing the right thing, with scammers using calm, authoritative language to guide each step. In some cases, victims were asked to visit physical bank branches or ATMs while staying on the call to withdraw or transfer larger amounts. If bank staff questioned the transactions, victims had already been coached to provide convincing explanations to avoid raising suspicion. Reports later showed that some individuals made multiple transactions in a single day, each one framed as a necessary step in securing their funds. Agencies like the AOIC documented cases where victims lost between $10,000 and over $200,000 through these staged interactions. The scam relied heavily on maintaining psychological pressure, balancing urgency with reassurance to keep victims compliant. Behind the scenes, funds were immediately moved across different accounts, often crossing international borders within minutes. By this stage, the system had reached a point where recovery was already unlikely, even though victims believed the process was still ongoing. The first real doubt usually appeared when victims tried to confirm the situation independently or noticed something didn't align with normal banking processes. Some attempted to call their bank directly using official numbers, only to realize there was no record of the supposed fraud investigation. Others were told by bank staff that the transfers they had made were irreversible and not part of any protective measure. In many cases, the scammers anticipated this moment and tried to regain control by warning victims not to trust other staff or external advice. This created confusion, making it difficult for victims to determine which information was real and which was part of the scam. Warning signs became clearer, such as inconsistent instructions, repeated requests for additional transfers, or sudden communication gaps. Authorities like the OAIC and banks began issuing public alerts about these impersonation tactics. By the time victims fully understood what had happened, funds had already been moved through multiple layers, leaving little chance of recovery. What started as a controlled, official-looking process began to unravel into a situation that no longer followed any legitimate procedure. The scam was typically exposed only after victims contacted their real bank or reported the incident to authorities. Complaints began to follow a similar pattern: calls from supposed bank staff, followed by instructions to move money for protection. Agencies like the AACC and the ACCC started compiling reports showing consistent methods across cases. Investigations revealed the use of caller ID spoofing, allowing scammers to display real bank phone numbers on victims' devices. Technical analysis also showed how funds were routed through multiple accounts, often using mule accounts, before being transferred overseas. In some cases, law enforcement traced operations back to organized fraud networks running coordinated call centers. Banks introduced new safeguards, including transaction delays and warnings for unusual transfers, based on these investigation findings. Despite these efforts, recovery rates remained low because funds were moved quickly and often converted into harder-to-trace forms like cryptocurrency. What appeared to be isolated incidents was ultimately identified as a structured system exploiting trust in institutions and authority. What made this scam effective was the precise use of authority, timing, and real system knowledge to control decisions in critical moments. Victims were not acting irrationally. They were following what appeared to be legitimate instructions from trusted institutions. The structure removed doubt early, replaced it with urgency, and maintained control through continuous communication. Because the interaction happened in real time, there was little opportunity for victims to pause, verify, or seek advice. Investigations showed that the same scripts, tools, and workflows were reused across thousands of cases globally. This meant that even as individual scams were reported, the broader system continued operating with minimal disruption. The financial impact extended beyond individual losses, affecting confidence in banking and institutional communication. For victims, the loss was often immediate and irreversible, with little warning before the situation escalated. The pattern remains active today, evolving with new technologies, but relying on the same core mechanism of authority used to extract money.